All right, just before we start, I just want to mention again, if you'd like to receive the notes, could you kindly take some time to fill up the form via the QR code? If you scan the QR code, it'll take you to a very simple page with just asking your name and your email address. I'll send up the notes in about 5 to 10 minutes time. So yeah, just take note of that. Okay, so today we are glad to have Dr. Anthony Loke with us again. Dr. Anthony Loke is no stranger to us. He's an expert in Old Testament. He taught me and Pastor Jeremy in seminary most of our Old Testament subjects, and yeah, we learned a lot from him. I think especially this is important as we are going into our new sermon series on First Kings, and I think that is always good for us to know a little bit more about the history, the context of the book, the intention of the author as we begin the series. I think Dr. Yifeng did a great job introducing the sermon, introducing the series on Sunday. I listened in from Impact Camp in Perdas, but yeah, I just had to listen because I'm writing the Bible study material and also because of this. But anyway, we're happy to have Dr. Anthony Loke here with us, and I will start with a short word of prayer, and then I'll just pass the time to him. All right, let's pray. Father, we want to thank you, Lord, for your servant, Dr. Anthony Loke. We want to pray, Lord, that as he expound your word from the text, from Kings, from the book of Kings, Lord, Father, we pray that your Holy Spirit will speak to us, that it will reveal, Lord, your word and will for us. All this we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so over to you, Dr. Anthony Loke.
Thank you, Yuel. Okay, let me put up the screen. Okay, so I hope you can see the screen. Let me set my pointer. Okay, so I always like the way PJEFC runs the thing. You have a series of sermons on a book, and then you do a short seminar to introduce people to the background issues. And I think this one really works because then the sermons are no longer just first time, but you are really, in a sense, hearing it a second time. So we're going to look at the book of Kings, and we have 2 Tuesdays to do it. So for tonight, part 1, I will take half of the book. There's the first 11 chapters. So when you think about Kings, of course, it has to do with thrones. And if you are a diehard fan like me, GOT diehard fan, and I read all of Martin's books, you know that it will involve kings and thrones and all the maneuvering succession narratives to tell you who becomes the next king. Intriguing for some, maybe for others, is it's a lot of politics. It's a lot of you can say subterfuge. Just like what the Queen say: if you want to play the Game of Thrones, you play to win. Okay. So when we think about Book of Kings, obviously we have to think about kings. So what is the Book of Kings? One, it is actually half of 4 books. What do I mean? Well, in Hebrew counting, the books of the history part of Israel are 4 because they do not divide this book of Samuel and Kings. So it's actually one long scroll. So you have 4: Joshua, Judges, Samuel, King. So you actually got 4 of this. And out of the 4, of course, the last book, we subdivide it into 2 nowadays, into 1 and 2 Kings, following the Greek translation. When the Bible was translated into Greek in the 2nd century BC, they felt that the scroll was too long, so they split into 2, so 1 and 2 Kings. And this, of course, this division has been followed into the Latin translation in the 3rd century AD. And then our English translations from the 15th century onwards also follow this. So today we have actually 6 books, 6 historical books: Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. So we are looking at only one half of the book of Kings, and that is 1st King. So the book is named, obviously, after all these kings. Of course, these kings are the Israelite and Judahite kings, all those who rule from Solomon time and after Solomon till the beginning of the Babylonian exile. So the Book of Kings, therefore, will cover the part of the last few years of David and his death, and then Solomon, who takes up quite a lot of the majority of the book, and then the rest of it, the kings that follow Solomon, and all the way down to Second Kings, which will lead us into the time of the exile. So who could have been the author of First Kings? Actually, nobody knows, okay? Jewish tradition always ascribe a certain prophet because they think that the prophets are the ones who hear God, and therefore they write these books after the inspiration of God. So the Jewish people have always accredited prophet Jeremiah to be the author of First and Second Kings. But if you look at the book itself, there is no indication. The books of First and Second Kings does not make any claim, I would say explicit claim to the author or even the editor. So for example, if you look at the beginning verse of 1 Kings, it just starts off with, now King David was old and advanced in years. There is no heading, no superscription like the books of the prophets, where you have that usual phrase, the word of God came to prophet so and so, and then usually then there's a time frame in the days of this king and this king. But when you look at the First Kings, it's anonymous. There is no explicit claim to any author or even the editor. Some people think that maybe these 4 books, or we look at it as 6 books, were all written by a single person. That was the German guy, Martin North, who thought that maybe one guy was responsible for putting together all these 4 books. And because these 4 books follow after the book of Deuteronomy and share many ideas, theology, and outlook like the book of Deuteronomy, he says that this history is often called what we call the Deuteronomic history, DTRH for short. So this whole set of 4 books follows the so-called theology of the book of Deuteronomy. For example, in the book of Deuteronomy, it tells us that if the people sin, then God will surely punish the people. But if they repent, then God will surely bring salvation and deliverance. So there is a so-called pattern involved in the book of Deuteronomy. And when we read the 4 history books, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, King, we see the same pattern being fleshed out, especially in the book of Judges, that cyclic pattern of apostasy, oppression by the enemy, cry for help, and then God sent deliverance through a judge, and then the land had rest for 40 years, 80 years. So you have the same cyclic pattern that the history books often share with the book of Deuteronomy. So some people call it, therefore, the Deuteronomic historian is that so-called author or editor. Even if he did not write the book, but he probably compiled them, put them together as one block. So you see that in the Jewish Old Testament layout, the book of Ruth is missing. Ruth is placed back in our so-called English translations because we try to follow a chronological order. But you find that Ruth is not placed after Judges and before 1st and 2nd Samuel, but Ruth is actually the 3rd section of the writings. This is therefore to show that whoever compiled these history books together want to give us a sense of a panorama of the history of Israel from the time of the conquest, because that will be the time of Joshua. And that whole thing leads us all the way to the time of the exile, Second Kings, especially the last chapter 25. So in a sense, the 4 books are complete. They tell you how the people conquered the land through Joshua. And then the next book, they tell us how the people almost lost the land in the time of Judges. And then it tells us in the 3rd book of 1st and 2nd Samuel how God raised up Samuel. And then from there, God gave the people the first king, Saul, and then followed by the 2nd king, David, and then leads to the 3rd king, which we will read in 1 Kings, chapter 2 onwards, as there's Solomon. And then onwards to the last book, where eventually even the kings failed, and the people lost the land, and they went to exile in Babylon. So obviously somebody sat down and ensured that we get a very good panoramic view of the history of Israel. throughout these 4 books. That's why for them, Ruth should not be in there to squeeze and affect the scheme of things. The whole scheme is basically, here are 4 history books that tell you about the history of God's people. So in a nutshell, what can we say is the book of First Kings? Well, obviously you can see it's a story of largely one major figure, and that is Solomon. He is the major figure, no longer David. David used to be the major figure in the second half of First Samuel and in the whole book of Second Samuel. But now in First Kings, David only has the first 2 chapters, and then he dies, and then Solomon gets almost 9 chapters. Okay, so he's a majority figure. And then, of course, after Solomon will come his son and all the other Israelite and Judahite kings. So the book of Kings is basically talking about the scene being set for Solomon to rise up. And then at Solomon's death, at the end of chapter 11, and then it tells us from what happened. So the first 11 chapters will cover the book, the person of Solomon. Then you find that from 12 onwards to 22, it will then be the history of the divided kingdom. Okay, this is the divided monarchy period. After the death of Solomon, his son Rehoboam could not hold the kingdom together, and the tribes split, 10 in the north, 2 in the south. So basically this is where you get that period. So next week we will look at more of the divided monarchy, where the first king of the northern kingdom will lead the people down the road to idolatry, and the kings of the southern kingdom after Solomon, none of them are strong and wise enough to hold the kingdom together, except for a few like Hezekiah, Josiah, Jehoshaphat, Uzziah. But there will eventually more bad kings and good kings, and the kings eventually lead the people to exile in Babylon. So if we were to try to perhaps think of a single phrase to sum up the whole book of First Kings, probably I will use this phrase, the decline of the monarchy. Okay, because you reach the apex and the climax at the peak with David and Solomon, and the rest of the chapters are all about the decline. The nation is actually going downhill. Okay, they are not going up like David and Solomon. They are now on the decline, and the kings would become increasingly worse. And the last 4 kings after Josiah are really hopeless, and the nation just falls apart. Okay, so that's basically what one king in a nutshell is. So it's a story about kings, okay, especially Solomon and the kings that come after him, all the way to the first part, and then the second part of Second Kings, then all the way down to the exile. So there are 22 chapters in the book, and you can see that the first 11 chapters already constitute 50% of the book, and that is on Solomon. Okay, so Solomon is a majority figure in the first half of the book. And then from the second half, you can see the kingdom is now divided, and you have now 2 nations, Israel in the north, Judah in the south. And the chapters will continue to show you how the 2 nations are on the road that it's actually to destruction eventually. And very interestingly, the book of First Kings end with stories of prophets. So First Kings will talk about prophets Elijah. Second King will open with stories of the prophet Elisha. Okay, so you have the 2 stories of Elijah and Elisha added into the book of Kings. I always wonder why both of these prophets, Elijah and Elisha, doesn't have books named after them, like Hosea, Amos, Jonah, Micah, Isaiah, Jeremiah. All these prophets had books named after them, but the stories of Elijah and Elisha are not on their own, but found inserted into the book of First Kings and Second Kings. So the last part are basically stories of the prophets interacting with the kings. And I think there is a reason, which I will mention this next week, why it is placed like this. So there is not just stories of kings alone, but stories of prophets and kings in tandem. Okay, and there's a very good reason for this. So we have 11 chapters to look at tonight, so that we don't have a lot to cover. So what I'll do is I will give you a bird's eye view of every chapter, and that will give you an idea of what the story is all about in the first 11 chapters of the book. So First Kings. First King actually doesn't start off with Solomon. Very interestingly, the first 2 chapters still have to do with David. So someone say actually the first 2 chapters of First Kings should have been the ending of Second Samuel. That means, well, whoever divided the scrolls should have placed these 2 chapters actually at the end of Second Samuel. Then it will make more sense, because Second Samuel 25 ends not with David's death or whatever. Okay, yeah, David's death only starts here in First Kings. So maybe, well, if I were to edit the story of Samuel and Kings, I might want to put the first 2 chapters actually to the end of Second Samuel. So what do we find in chapter 1? In chapter 1, we read of the story, a very interesting story about David's importance. And you find many scholars in their commentaries will then always ask a question: why would the author of First King start off with a story about David's importance? We see David lying with this Shunammite girl, Abishag, and he's so old and feeble that he actually doesn't sleep with her. He only uses her as a booster to warm himself. And I think this story is placed here, and it serves as a way to remind us the old King David has lost his virility. That's why he no longer sleeps with Abishag. Remember all the stories of David in the 1st and 2nd Samuel. David is someone who loves women. Okay, he had already Saul's daughter Michal, and later he married another woman, the wife of Nabal, Abigail, and then he has some more wives after that. So you find that David picks up wives like picking up trophies. And here is, you can say, a very good opportunity for him to have another conquest. But he doesn't sleep with her because he is no longer able to. The king has lost his virility, and that loss of importance is actually a sign to the son, Adonijah, that my father has lost the ability to govern as well. The two is connected, very interesting. The loss of virility is connected with the ability to govern. And so that is a sign to Adonijah. The first son, Absalom, had already revolted against David. You find that story earlier on. The second son is not mentioned, and there's a third son, but then it's a fourth son, Adonijah, who takes the initiative. He says, well, I can't wait for my father to die before the throne passed to me. And so he made an abortive attempt to seize the throne while the father was still alive. Now, of course, that will be considered a coup d'etat. Because you don't overthrow a king when he's still alive. If you are a son, you wait. But he wanted to, you can say he probably couldn't wait, and so he tried this coup. And it was abortive because the news began to spread back. And of course, one obvious glaring omission was Solomon was not invited to the coronation of Adonijah. Okay, again, we can discuss and speculate why. Some people say, well, maybe because Adonijah thinks that his stepbrother, out of that union between David and Bathsheba, even though they were legally married by the time Solomon was born, he still probably didn't see him as a legitimate claimant to the throne. So never invited Solomon. So news came back, and we find in these verses the frantic attempts by those who were close to David to try to rectify the situation. Prophet Nathan and Bathsheba, his favorite wife, all galvanized into action. It's actually very interesting to see that if David loved Bathsheba so much, at this point in life, Bathsheba is not even in the picture. Okay, either the king has grown old or they have fallen apart, and even Nathan seemed to be like out of the picture. And these two are galvanized to action. They pushed David and reminded David, don't you remember the oath you made to Bathsheba, how you promised that Solomon will be the one on the throne? See, one of David's pitfall was he never actually named the successor, which that's why encouraged the first son, Absalom, to revolt, and now encouraged the fourth son, Adonijah, to also revolt. He actually failed to proclaim Solomon as his successor. If he had done that, there would have been no abortive attempt by Adonijah to claim, because it would have been the news. Everybody would know who is the successor. So the old feeble king has to be pushed to make the announcement that Solomon will be crowned his successor. And of course, as you read those verses, we see now he's brought, and the prophet Nathan then anoints him, and he rides his father's donkey. And the news then filtered back to the other coronation party. So imagine it's like two rival claimants to the throne, each one having their own coronation. And then when the news came to this group, then they realized they have failed, because obviously David has made his stand, and David's on the side of Solomon, together with the prophet Nathan and all the others. And here we find Adonijah runs. He seeks refuge in the sanctuary, God's house, grabbing hold of the horns of the altar, which was an ancient way of saying, you seek asylum. And the one who grabbed hold of the horns will not be punished. His life will not be taken from him. So it is like, you seek sanctuary. So he seek refuge by claiming the throne, and he asked that, no harm come to him. Of course, he's promised on the condition that he'll be a good boy, and he'll be exiled to his house and stay there and not do anything like before. So in bargain for his own life, you find, therefore, the abortive attempt came to an end, and the Adonijah was exiled to his house. So Solomon becomes king. And that is just the first chapter. Second chapter is now where we find David meets up with Solomon and gave final instructions to Solomon. The first 9 verses are basically a fatherly advice. Okay, a father who has been a king for 40 years, giving fatherly advice to his son how to rule. So you can read those verses and reminding his son that, if you trust God and God will be faithful, he will bless you. But the funny thing is, if you read in that instructions, it includes 2 things. 2, what I would call deathbed wishes to carry out. If you're about to die, and on your deathbed, you make 2 requests to your children to carry them out after you're dead. And that's what we call deathbed wishes. And there were 2 persons singled out. And David reminds Solomon, Solomon, I know you're wise, and you will know what to do, okay, about these 2 guys. One is Joab, the general. And one is Shimei, the one who cursed David when David was on the run from Absalom. Obviously, David remembered these 2 characters till the day he died. Okay, he carried, I would say, David carried grudges, lifelong grudges against these 2 persons. Now, we all know the story of Joab. Joab actually killed 2 good generals, Amasa and the other one, can't remember. Slip off my tongue. And he is responsible, okay, for knocking off 2 good generals. And David, just couldn't do anything because he was quite powerful. And then was this guy who cursed David when he was on the run. And although David spared him later on and made an oath to forgive him, but the king somehow seemed to, either forget this oath and tell Solomon, these 2 guys, they had hurt me, and I know you will find a way to take care of the matter. It's actually really, if you read what David said to Solomon, you can see how it is carefully phrased. It means, son, I want you to take action, but you do it carefully. Don't make it rash, but you must do steps which are legal and right, and then the guilt is not on you. So you find a way for them to stumble, and then you pick on that, and then you carry out my wishes. And this is the last picture of what we have about the great King David. That great king who defeated Goliath, that great king who held the nation together, even though there were 10 tribes were loyal to the son of late King Saul, and how David win them over, and then how David fought against his enemies and built up the kingdom. That great David, the one who wrote the Psalms, and now on his deathbed, we find him so petty, holding lifelong grudges against two persons, and then leaving Solomon to carry out two of his wishes. In fact, I will always tell my students in the class when we do historical books, Solomon actually started his reign with blood on his hands because he had to carry out his father's wishes. Solomon, whose name sounds like Shalom, which is peace. Okay, Solomon actually is a SH, Sholomoth, that is his Hebrew name, come from the same root word as Shalom, as peace, SHSLM. So the man of peace didn't start off his kingdom peacefully, but because he carried out his father's deathbed wishes. So when the king dies, you find that in the rest of the chapter is now Solomon carrying out his father's wishes. And there were not just two, but now they got four persons. Okay. One, of course, was his brother, the one who had tried to usurp the throne. And you find that he was able to find a way to eventually do away with Adonijah. Okay. So for unfortunately breaking the oath to stay in the house, he did not stay, and so he was then ordered to be killed. Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, struck him and killed him. Then Abathia was a priest who had sided with Absalom, the first son, to usurp the throne of David. And you will find Abathia is now banished to his hometown, his so-called his estate, because he's in a way no longer now allowed to be priest to the Lord. Okay. And so we find that he is now exiled back to his hometown. And Zadok, whom David had used to replace Abathia, the Zadokite priests are now the ones who runs the priesthood. And then Joab, the commander, whom David gave a deathbed wishes. And again, you find that Solomon was able to find a way for Benaiah to again get rid of Joab. And then even Shimei, Solomon was able to find a way because this guy somehow forgot about being confined to his house, left the house in pursuit of looking for a servant. And because he crossed the bounds of his house and therefore obviously broke that promise he has given to David. And then Solomon took that opportunity to also get rid of him. So not just two, but actually four persons. And so imagine all of them are, except for Abathia, three of them are put to death. And then that's where then we find the final phrase. So the kingdom was established in the hand of Solomon. Very interesting. He says, so the kingdom of Solomon was established. Okay. Does it mean that the kingdom could not be established until Solomon finished up dealing with these unfinished matters left by his father? Very interesting. That means as long as Solomon does not carry out these things, the kingdom is still not established. I can understand about the first one, because if we have a rival claimant to the throne, and eventually if you don't deal with it, this guy can always rise up. You know, sometimes when kings are too forgiving, they forgive their so-called rival claimants, who knows, this guy may then turn toward again. See, so sometimes I can understand why you have to settle this issue. Make sure that, you know, you don't have a guy who can rise up against you and then backbite you and take the throne from you. But the others, well, maybe Joab was a difficult guy. And so Solomon trusted the other commander, Benaiah, and so he's replaced by another general whom Solomon probably wanted. So we find at least Joab is removed. But she made the critic, well, he only cursed David. But again, got rid, and then now, only then it is firmly established. Only when all this are finished, then Solomon's kingdom is, in a sense, established, or you can say consolidated. Then now comes the story of Solomon. Very interestingly, if you were the author of First Kings and telling the story of Solomon, what would you begin with? Here, the author begins with a very interesting story. Solomon marries the daughter of Pharaoh to make a marriage alliance. Because in those days, political alliances were often made with marriages. I give my daughter to marry your son, and therefore we seal the alliance between our two kingdoms. Now, it's not just political alliance. Because once you marry, let's say, the daughter of another king, then you become a son-in-law. So there is now family, in a sense, involved. But there's also a darker side to such marriages. Again, I remind my students, when Pharaoh gave his daughter to marry Solomon, it's not just because Pharaoh likes Solomon. No, sometimes you see, you have to understand the reason why people make political marriages in the past. When I give my daughter to you to marry, it's actually therefore holding a sword over your head, because then, you see, my daughter now is in your household and you marry her. You better make sure nothing happens to my daughter, because if something happens, it gives me an excuse for me to attack and invade your kingdom. Do you realize political marriages are often double-sided? Not because I love you, I want you to be my son-in-law, I give you my daughter. No, when I give you my daughter, it means you better take good care. Anything happens, it will give me that flimsy excuse to invade your kingdom. Here, of course, Solomon is thinking of an alliance with Pharaoh, because Egypt at that time was, you can say, the world empire. The other empires like Assyria, Babylon, the Neo-Assyria Empire and the Neo-Babylonian Empire has not yet arisen. It will be another 200-300 years before Assyria comes up. So here with the world power, you make an alliance that then, of course, is to your benefit, because you end up then be able to do trade. And actually, there was a hidden motive. Solomon wanted horses for his chariots, because any army, you need therefore cavalry. You need to have chariots. You can't just have foot soldiers, infantry. Okay, infantry versus cavalry. Cavalry always wins. Okay, so you need horses, and Egypt has the most horses at this time because of the flat land. They were able to domesticate the horse and then use the horses to draw chariots. So Solomon marries Pharaoh's daughter also because he wants to get this idea of importing horses in. Okay, we will see this in one of the verses here. And all this is what perhaps the author has in mind, because there is a verse in Deuteronomy that reminds us that the people of God are not to return, they're warned not to return back to Egypt. Because remember when they came out of Egypt, one of the main complaints against Moses was, Moses, you took us out of the desert to die. In Egypt, we have all the best food, the fresh food and all this. No, you could eat cucumber, dill, and melon. You brought us out there, and their hearts were always longing for Egypt. And so God reminds the people, the warning is not to return back to Egypt, but Egypt enslaved you. God delivered you from Egypt. Why do you want to go back to Egypt? Now, the first thing we read of Solomon when he begins his reign, after he has established his kingdom, is he makes an alliance with Egypt. The very thing which God says no. And you can see these verses, I think the author is giving us a hint. Something is not right. Okay, Solomon's heart is not fully with God. Okay, because he wants power, he wants his horses, he wants biggest alliance. And the fact that you marry Pharaoh's daughter is a foreigner who worship all her gods. And again, that will break another rule where you are not supposed to marry someone outside the Israelites, because you mean following after the gods. So Solomon breaks a lot of rules in this one little story of just 3 verses. But surprisingly, it's tempered by the next story where Solomon goes to Gibeon to, and that's where he had a dream. Okay, he's going there to this high place because there was still no temple yet. And his father had sacrificed in the high places there. And so he went to Gibeon. Obviously, this place also had a high place. And there he had a dream. And in the dream, God appeared and asked Solomon what he wants. And we all know the story. God wanted to find out what was Solomon's request. Would he ask for wealth? Would he ask for power? Would he ask for the usual things that people will ask? Well, we all know the story. Solomon asked for wisdom. Because as God says, if you ask for wisdom, the rest will fall in line. With wisdom, you will have power and wealth as well. So Solomon seemed to, at least got this right. He asked for wisdom rather than just power and wealth, whatever. And because he asked for wisdom, interestingly, the next section of the chapter, we find that his wisdom is put to the test. Well, it's like sometimes very ironic. You ask for wisdom, then God will make sure, okay, let's see how your wisdom goes. And his wisdom is put to the test. He went back home, and that's where he's confronted by two prostitutes who appear before the king. Each of them had a child, but one of the child died in the night because the mother rolled over and slept on the child. And so there was only one living child, but so that mother or the dead child exchanged the living child and claimed the child to be hers. We all know the story. That's where we will see, obviously, you need a bit of wisdom to be able to know how to judge between these two mothers. How do you find out, in those days, lacking DNA testing, how do you find out who was the real mother of the living child and who was the mother of the dead child? Solomon's wisdom obviously was put to the test, and he knew what to do. He knew mother's love for the child will make sure that the mother will do everything to protect the child. So here, Solomon then asks for a sword and says, okay, let's divide the living baby into half. Then both mothers can have half the baby. And you see the immediate result, that the fake mother, the one whose child died, was contented to have that, whereas the real mother of the living child was willing to allow the child not to be killed, but to give the child to the other mother for the sake of saving them. And Solomon then realized who was the real mother. So Solomon's wisdom was put to the test. Okay, just as he asked for wisdom, the next verse you find it is put to the test. Chapter 4, we find it is basically a list of who were the people who served under Solomon. Just like what we have in the story of David. David had also his men who served him. There were also mercenaries and all those who worked with David. And Solomon too has his people. And then followed by a list of Solomon's wealth and his wisdom. Because he asked for wisdom, therefore it brings, he asked for wisdom, and that wisdom brings him power and wealth, just as God already said. You ask for the right thing. Okay, wisdom is a foundation to the other two. If you ask for wealth and you don't have wisdom to use it, then you waste your wealth. If you ask for power but you don't have wisdom to temper it, you will allow power to abuse and misuse you. So wisdom is a foundation for the other two. So we find that God does bless Solomon with both wealth and power. And then there is this last part where we find Solomon has this wisdom that surpasses everybody else. He knows names of plants and spoke of trees and beasts of the animals, birds and reptiles and fish. Wow, almost like a walking encyclopedia. So Solomon was like a walking encyclopedia. He knew all the names, of such things. And people came from all over the nation to listen to his wisdom. So he was really like a walking CD-ROM. He had almost all his wisdom at the fingertips. That was the amount of wisdom that he had. So much so that he says here, all who heard about him really wonder at his wisdom. Then the next three chapters, 5, 6, 7, are connected because they are now focused on the temple. Remember 2 Samuel chapter 7, it was David who felt that he wanted to build God's a temple. He says that all the gods in the neighboring countries all of them have a national temple to house their God. And for Israel, God supposedly still dwell in a tent, the tent or the tabernacle. Remember, the ark was always placed in a tent, and then when the ark was returned by the Philistines, and then the ark stayed at a place called Kiriath Jearim, and it was still in a tent. And so David eventually one day decided to move the ark and the tent to Jerusalem, into the city of David. And it was still there. So until 2 Samuel 7, David wanted to build a house, but then God says, no, thank you, David, because one reason given was, David, your hands are stained with blood throughout all your conquest and war. So it is not David who will build the temple, the house of God, but will be the son, the man of peace. Remember, the man of Shalom is supposed to be the one who will build God's house. So we find in chapter 5, here Solomon now carries out that so-called idea of his father of building God a house, a national temple, as grand as it can be. Okay. From the descriptions of the size and all this, we know the building is a rectangular building, and slightly bigger than the tent or the tabernacle. And of course, all the furniture pieces will now be magnified in size, because now you no longer mobile, but more stationary. So you have the bowl, the bronze level of water, you have the altar of burnt offering, and then in the holy place, you have the table of showbread, the menorah, and the altar of burnt incense, and then in the Holy of Holies, the ark. Okay, so the plan is in motion, and you need wood. And the best wood, of course, was the Lebanon cedar trees. Hiram of Tyre, one of the Lebanon seaports, was a good friend of David and also a good friend of Solomon. So they made a treaty where Solomon will import in Lebanon cedar, and of course, he will pay back in terms of in kind, in terms of silver and gold, and then barley, wheat, and olive oil. And then Solomon set up a forced labor of 30,000 men, including others, hewers and stone cutters and all this, almost 150,000 to do the building of the temple. And so you have one whole chapter in 6 that tells us how Solomon will begin to build a temple and how God is pleased, because it says, God says, whenever I come down to earth, then the temple will be like my footstool, where God says, I will stand over the earth. So the temple will be like God's dwelling place on earth. So God promises that he will come down and dwell in the temple. Okay. And the temple took 7 years to finish. Of course, with his immense power and wealth, and putting in lots of people to do it, 7 years could be done. But he also started off on another project, and that was his own palace. But look at the amount of years it took to do his palace, almost twice the length, okay? Almost twice the length. And some people think that maybe his palace was even more elaborate, more beautiful than even the temple. Okay, obviously, if you take 13 years instead of 7 to finish building your own palace, obviously it must have been a very big project or a very grand project. Okay, then the last part of 7, swing back to the list of the temple furnishings, what was in the temple. Again, a very detailed description, like in the book of Exodus, where we are told of all the different things in the tabernacle, and what even the material and the size, the length, the breadth, and the height of it. Here we have similar description of what the temple contained. Okay, all the pots, the pans, the shovels, everything is all listed out. Okay, by the time you reach 8, we find now the temple is completed, and Solomon now brings the ark, which had stopped at the city of David, because David brought it and left it in his city of David, because there was no temple yet. The temple is in the northern part of the city, on the northern side beyond the city of David. So when Solomon builds the temple, then he brings the ark, and one can see the description of what the people did. They sacrificed numerous sheep and oxen along the way, and then the rest of the chapter you find Solomon does three things. One, he blesses God, the first prayer. Second prayer is a prayer of dedication. So first one is a prayer of blessing. The second one is a prayer of dedication of the temple. And then the third one is Solomon's benediction for the people who had come and blessing all the assembly so that as they departed, they go off with God's blessing. So very long prayer, and one can take note of this prayer that he prays. In August, I'll be doing a 4-week Bible study with St. Paul PJ, and it will be called OT Great Prayers, some of the great prayers uttered in the Old Testament. And one of the 4, of course, will be Solomon's prayer, where I will focus. So if you're interested, you can sign up to join that session that night to listen to how Solomon prayed his prayer to God and what can we learn from a prayer like this. The rest of chapter 8, again, is a list of all the sacrifices and the feast days which were used. And so the whole celebration of the dedication took 7 days. And at the end of it, on the 8th day, he sends everybody back. And everybody, of course, goes back very happy, joyful and glad, because they say God has been great and God has shown his goodness to David, his servant, and especially now to his son Solomon, who has built this temple. So one can imagine, if we were to look at the temple of Solomon, it must have been a very grand thing. There was a rabbinic saying that whoever has seen the temple would have seen a great thing. And I think it must have been very grand for his time in the 9th century. Of course, Solomon's temple will be outdone by King Herod's temple at the end of the 1st century BC, and that cost was almost double the size of Solomon's temple. But in his day, in the 9th century, this would have been probably a very great and grand building. As we come towards the last 3 chapters of the book, or the story of Solomon, now we come to chapter 9. And chapter 9, we find that God appears again to Solomon. First time was, of course, in that dream at Gibeon. Now God appears, and God then tells Solomon, I heard your prayer and your plea which you made before me, and I've consecrated this house that we have built by putting my name there forever. But then God then left behind a promise and a threat, so that to Solomon, God says, if these are conditional statements, you see. If you will walk before me as David your father walked, with integrity of heart and uprightness, doing according to all that I've commanded you and keeping my statutes and my rules, and then the promise will then have the so-called then. Okay. These are the if-then conditional statements. Then God says, I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised David your father, saying, you shall not lack a man on the throne of David. But then you also have the threat. But the threat also comes in the same form of the if and the then. Okay. But if you turn aside from following me, you and your children, and do not keep my commandments and my statutes that I have set before you, but go and serve other gods and worship them, then you have this, then I will cut off Israel from the land I have given them, and the house that I have consecrated for my name I will cast out of my sight, and Israel will become a proverb and a byword among all the people, and this house will become a heap of ruins. Notice the threat is even God's house will be destroyed. Okay. I think it took the Jews a long time to figure that out. The Israelites couldn't understand how when the Babylonians came and destroyed the temple, they just couldn't understand how God could allow his own house to be destroyed. But God has already given the threat here in verses 6 to 9. My house will become a heap of ruins, and everybody passing by will shake their heads and say, why has God done this? You see? So God already gave Solomon this if then. If you do this, then God promised I'll do this. But if you don't do this, then I will then do this. And you can see how this will be worked out in the rest of the books. Because Solomon and the successors after him will not be able to keep that promise. Rather, they will eventually continue to fail. And that's why the threat of the destruction of God's house will become even clearer and more imminent. The rest of the chapters deal with Hiram, who had exchanged cedar and gold for the timber. And Solomon had also promised 20 cities in Galilee. But unfortunately, the cities are all probably very small and no more very ulu. And Hiram's not very happy with it, okay? And you then jump back to the part where, how did Solomon build the temple? He used a lot of forced labor. Remember, we talked about the 30,000 men who were forced, conscripted to build. And these people were not only just building the temple, 7 years, remember, to do the temple, 13 years to do his palace. And after finishing the palace, he built the Milo. The Milo is the upper fortification of the city of David, a very big wall that separates the city of David from the Ophel. The Ophel is the so-called the southern part. The temple is here. The temple complex will eventually be here. The Ophel is this part, okay? And today you can actually visit this. It's called the Davidson Southern Wall excavation site. So you can actually visit all this. So the Milo was this huge wall which he spent. And of course, we have discovered parts of that wall from this time. And then the rest of the Jerusalem wall, the walls of Jerusalem also he built. And also the people went up to fortify the city of Hazor, right in the north, above the Sea of Galilee, Megiddo to near Mount Carmel, and then Gezer on the road near Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. He spent time fortifying all these cities to protect. So the people not only just built the temple, but they actually spent a lot of time doing other things as well. And you then find that, well, Solomon also not just built his palace, he also built a house for his own wife. Pharaoh's daughter got his own wife, especially. So you have that phrase. And then there's a little interesting thing about Solomon. Not was he only contented ruling only Israel. He actually had ships stationed here, okay, at a place called Ebion Gezer. And he got Hiram, who is up here, to send sailors down here. And from here, the sailors will sail to a place called Ophir to mine gold and bring back gold. Okay, so we are told that he actually had a port called Ebion Gezer. Today, Ebion Gezer, of course, is no longer there, but Israel still have a port at this tip of the tongue of Aqaba, and this place is called Eilat. Okay, today it is still there. So Israel still have a seaport, and at Eilat there are actually 6 mini submarines stationed there. Very interesting. Okay, so that's Solomon. Then Solomon's wisdom is again put to the test, this time when you have now the most famous foreign dignitary coming to visit Solomon to exchange wisdom. And of course, to also test up wisdom, because he says she heard about him. She came to test him with hard questions. Not just her, but probably bringing wise men with her as well. So where is Queen Sheba from? Well, some people think maybe from Nubia, maybe from Ethiopia. Okay, so she came, and of course, when she left, she gave Solomon 120 talents of gold, a great quantity of spices and precious stones and all sorts of things. In fact, there is a Jewish tradition that says that actually when she went back home, she had something extra. The Jewish tradition said that she actually slept with Solomon, and she was pregnant when she went back home, and she will give birth to a son fathered by Solomon and her, and this will start the so-called that kingdom of Ethiopia. Okay, that is a Jewish tradition, but nobody knows whether it's true or not. Okay, so you have that famous dignitary Sheba coming, and then of course from the seaport where he had a fleet of sailors, and they began to bring back gold. Again, where is Ophir? Most people think that Ophir could be perhaps the Horn of Africa, beyond the Horn of Africa, and maybe in Africa he went there to mine, and that's why you have this famous tale called King Solomon's mines. You know, people speculate, where did he mine all his gold? Where did he bring his gold from? And the rest of the chapter, it talks about his fabulous wealth, a description of how rich he was. So rich that gold was treasured more than silver. Silver was like not important to Solomon. Then his fabulous wisdom, where again he outdo people from other places. Okay, no one else could have wisdom like him. And then the last part deals with his large number of horses. Remember, one of the reasons why I think he married Pharaoh's daughter was he wanted horses. And again, this was a warning from Egypt, about going back to Egypt, to keep on being relying on Egypt. In fact, this will be a trend which will be carried on even into the 8th century. In the 8th century, the prophet Isaiah had to warn King Hezekiah, you know, what do you think about the horses, the horses and the chariots of Egypt? They're not gods. They're only men and flesh and blood, you know. It is in quietness and in trust and in returning and in rest that you find salvation, not in the chariots and horses of Egypt. But Solomon obviously was so dependent. That's why he had to have that marriage, that alliance, as well as importing the number of horses, and to be able to have a large cavalry placed at Megiddo. So at Megiddo, that's where he had all these chariots, and he was able to then control that whole valley of Jezreel. Okay, final chapter. Final chapter resembles what we find in chapter 3, verse 1 to 3. That little 3 verses to remind us of Solomon loving Pharaoh's daughter, marrying a foreigner and not Israelite. Here now we see his weaknesses continue. He continued to love foreign women, and we are told now he has 700 wives, 300 concubines. Wow, I wonder how he can remember who is who. Tonight is who? 700 wives, 300 concubines, almost 1,000. Okay. And you have to pander to them because each wife will probably bring their own gods from their own nation. If Solomon's wife, Pharaoh's daughter, can have her own house and temple, and then probably the wives from other kingdoms will also ask for that. That's why they had temples for Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. And so you have temples for these other gods as well. Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites. And so building high places for all this. So the wives turned his heart away to other gods. And that was, again, that solemn warning about marrying a foreign wife who does not worship the same God, and the possibility of you being led astray. And so God then was angry with Solomon because his heart has turned away from God. And God told Solomon, okay, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you, only leaving behind Judah and Jerusalem. Now, of course, it's basically 10 kingdoms. Judah and Benjamin, of course, will be united as the southern part of Judah. And then the northern kingdom of Israel will be made up of the 10 larger tribes. So God will tear away the kingdom. He will only keep it for the sake of his father David. Okay. And in the last days of Solomon's life, God raised up 3 adversaries that he had to deal with. So that means he didn't end his life on with a note of peace or whatever. He had to deal with 3 things. And again, we don't have time to look at it, but I've given some of the verses here to think about. 3 adversaries God raised up. One of them was Hadad, the Edomite. And if you were to refer back to 2 Samuel, it is where David's father had almost eliminated the whole household, the royal household of the Edomites, except Hadad, who ran away and he was saved. And Hadad went to Egypt to stay. And then later, when Solomon became king, Hadad asked the Egyptian pharaoh for permission to leave Egypt, to go back and to become an adversary to Solomon, to give trouble and to make trouble for Solomon. So because he was the one who escaped, and if David had killed everyone, then of course there will be no adversary. But because he escaped, he will now prove to be an adversary to Solomon. Rezon's story also is found here. And again, Rezon also somehow was able to escape, and he went on to Damascus to live. And there he actually Rehoboam was someone who lived in Egypt, who lived up north in Israel, and unfortunately running there, and then he then becomes adversary against. And Jeroboam was also Israelite, and actually serving as one of the taskmasters in the building program. And he was actually, he would say, pro Solomon from the beginning. But eventually a prophet appeared to Jeroboam and told him how God will tear the kingdom apart and give to Jeroboam 10 of the tribes. And he will then start off the northern kingdom of Israel. So Jeroboam, the first son of Nebat, will become the first king of the northern kingdom. So Solomon had to deal with 3 adversaries towards the end of his life. And then finally, the last 3 verses then tells us, now the rest of the acts of Solomon and all that he did and his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the Acts of Solomon? So there was an earlier book called the Book of the Acts of Solomon, which no longer survived. But some of those stories are now probably incorporated here into First Kings. And at that time, Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel all 40 years. And Solomon slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David, his father. And Rehoboam, his son, reigned in his place. So he also reigned 40 years like his father David. So let's end with looking at some lessons. What lessons can we learn from the story of kings? Well, as I said, First Kings continued the story of kingship, basically with the story of the death of David. And it starts off with that 2 chapters, remember, that interesting 2 chapters of David, where a story of David's importance is seen as a sign to Adonijah, now is the time, because my father cannot govern anymore, I will take over. And so his abortive coup. And then David's failure to name the successor, which was Solomon, encouraged again the 4th son, and as well as the 1st son, Absalom, to revolt against his father. Thankfully, with the acumen of Prophet Nathan and Bathsheba, that coup was able to be put down, and Solomon then rise up and to become the 3rd king of the United Kingdom. Okay, so First Kings therefore starts off with the last stories of David, and then the first 11 chapters will deal with Solomon. But as you read on by next week, you will see it is a sad story because it's a nation's decline. Okay. If we were to look at it, you can say, well, we start out with Saul, but Saul failed. And then we had David failed a bit, but then we have Solomon. But then after that, it's the story of decline. So one could say they already reached the peak after Solomon, but then the rest of the story is actually a story of the downfall of the nation, culminating in exile for both Northern Kingdom of Israel in 722 to the Assyrians, and Judah being exiled by the Babylonians in 586 BC. So both nations actually end up in exile. The Second Kingdom, the Southern Kingdom, lasted 150 years longer than the Northern Kingdom. But both kingdoms end with exile. Both kingdoms lost the land that God has given. So why did the nation decline? Well, one can see the seeds of decline already planted in the last years of Solomon. Okay. If Solomon had not faltered in the last years, maybe you can say the seeds would not have been planted, because in the last years of his life, his apostasy was greater than his wisdom. You know, Solomon was supposed to be the wisest man, but very often we realize he turned out to be the greatest fool. The wisest man was also the greatest fool because he never lived up his wisdom. His wives drew his heart away from God, leading to apostasy, and even his wisdom could not counter that. So he therefore planted the seeds of decline. So the book of First Kings is about kings and those in leadership. And you will find that as you read the rest of the story, the author will weigh out all the good kings versus the bad kings. All the good kings are compared with David, who walked in the footsteps of David and did what was right. And all the bad kings will be compared to the first king of the northern kingdom, Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who led the nation down the road to idolatry. So one by one, all the kings will be weighed. Are you a good king or are you a bad king? So if you are in leadership and in a way you are fulfilling that kingship role, what legacy will we leave behind? You know, there were like two Solomon, the early Solomon and you have the later Solomon. The early Solomon was one who actually loved God. Okay. And I think he would have started off well. Chapter 3, verse 3. Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David, his father. The early Solomon was one who loved God, but the latest Solomon was the one whose heart was always torn and turned away by his wives to other gods. So what are we leaving behind? What legacy? Solomon's legacy is, in a sense, ambiguous. You had the good and the bad. And Solomon's blessings, even though God has blessed him so much, he asked for wisdom, and the wisdom brought him wealth and power. Unfortunately, could not prevent him from falling into spiritual complacency. And that eventually will lead to apostasy and idolatry. I think he could have been a bit more complacent, thinking that, well, I'm supposed to be so wise and I'm supposed to be able to walk in God's path. I would not fall. And like a lot of people who say that, eventually you will fall because we all have our Achilles heel. There will always be one weak spot where if we are not careful, we find that will often be the downfall. So he had that Achilles heel, that one weakness with his love for foreign women. So if we were to take the story of First Kings into the larger picture about our own nation and the leaders, well, where is our nation and our leaders heading? Just as Israel and Judah headed off to exile and lost the promise of land, are our nation and the leaders who are heading it, taking our nation down the slippery slope? Okay? I mean, we all know about our own political situation, where we can have a legitimate government removed by a government that came about from backdoor conspiracy, and a government that could suspend with emergency and so that they don't even need to meet. Thankfully, we have now got back a legitimate government, although it's a unity government. But, well, look at our leaders. Are they like Solomon, the early Solomon, or the later Solomon? Are our leaders marked by true repentance and contrition? Remember all those conditional statements, if then. God reminds the people, if you walk, then I will bless you. If you forget me, then I will bring destruction, even destroying the house. So which road is Malaysia heading? Quo vadis, Malaysia? Okay, I'll pass it back to Pastor Yu Yong if you have questions to ask.
All right, I've collected some of your questions already. I'll just put in the chat. We have quite a few questions. Some have been answered already, but maybe it's good to just reiterate some of the answers. For those of us who still have questions, could you just write it down in the chat group or message me? I'll ask on your behalf. The first question is did David commit the sin when he ordered the death of his enemies? I think it's referring to Kings chapter 1, First Kings chapter 2, when he was about to die, he asked Solomon to kill off the two people. Was it a sin or not?
Well, you can say he did not commit the sin. He got his son to do the job. But then he said, I trust you, Solomon, that when you carry out the job, you will not incriminate yourself. Which was true, because when Solomon did the removing of these guys, it was because those guys broke their oath. Remember, they had the oath, and then he waited for the moment, and when those guys broke the oath, then Solomon did the job of knocking off. So in a sense, it's like, well, as David says, I trust you, Solomon, my son, to know how to use the wisdom to get rid of these two guys. Now, I'm not sure whether there's a very dangerous precedent to actually follow. So the next time you ask someone in the church, hey, I trust your wisdom, you know what to do. But I guess a lot of pastors, again, a lot of leaders do that, isn't it? A lot of leaders actually will often say, I trust and you know what to do. And so they don't incriminate themselves. But I think here, David, you can say, yeah, I mean, as I said, he carried these grudges throughout his life. He never forgave Shimei, although he had actually forgiven him and spared the guy when he got back. Remember when he got back the throne from Absalom, he said, this is a day of rejoicing, no more killing. So actually he spared Shimei. But he never forget the incident and he never forgave and he carried to his death and then left it with his poor son to finish off the job of Shimei. I mean, you think about it, that is David. I don't think you ever teach stories like this of David to your Sunday school. But this is the David we find. He carried a lifelong grudge. Okay.
Right, the next
Great
one.
man, but you really, there are real weaknesses.
Okay. Yeah. Second, I think it's two questions in a row. Solomon was so wise. How come he made so many wrong
Yeah, I already said, he was the wisest king, but the greatest fool. See, a fool is a person who do not take their own advice. You know, a lot of times we give advice to people. Sometimes we don't take advice on ourselves. You know, we should drink our own medicine, treat ourselves. Very good. We are very good at giving advice, but sometimes we are very slow to take our own advice. I think Solomon, yeah, he had a lot of wisdom. He probably gave wisdom to people and all this, but you'll be a fool if you don't take your own wisdom. Okay. And I think he knew very well his wives were pulling his heart away from God. But because he loved them, pandered for them, and that's it, you see. And then he already set the precedent of building this for his Pharaoh's daughter. And then all the other wives say, okay, you do that. I also want one for myself. And you end up doing one after another. And so his heart was increasingly torn away.
Question 3 was, how big was the kingdom of David at the height of his power? I think during David's time, and were they considered a superpower in those days?
Okay, the superpower at that time was Egypt. Okay, as I already mentioned, Assyria, Babylon had not yet arisen from the horizon. So the time of Saul, David, Solomon actually came at a time when there was a power vacuum in the area. Egypt was actually on the decline. Egypt already was at their peak in the 14th, 15th century. By the time you come to then 12th century Ramesses, that was also the climax, the peak. But other than that, by the time you come to the monarchy period of Israel, Egypt was actually now not having very strong kings. After Ramesses II, there was Menepa, and there was Ramesses III. After that, you don't find very strong pharaohs, already declining. And then Assyria was slowly arising, but not yet strong. So there was a power vacuum in the area. And that means Israel, when they began their monarchy under Saul, David, Solomon, they were not disturbed. There were no big brothers on the horizon threatening their borders. So David was able to expand the borders to the biggest. If you read the description, the borders spread across to the west, to the Mediterranean Sea. The borders also spread across the River Jordan onto Ammonite territory or to the east. The borders on the north stretch all the way to the river Damascus, which is submitted for at the Lebanon mountains, and then all the way to the river Egypt, which is a river in Sinai Peninsula. So you have geographical markings of David's so-called borders, and that will be the biggest. Okay. I think Solomon also continued to consolidate David's borders, so that was perhaps at the height of their power. But they were not a superpower. The stories of David had to be read like the stories of our Malacca sultanates. You know, when you read the Malacca Sultanate, we think, wow, Malacca Sultanate, the Sultan, Mansur Shah must have been a very powerful king. But actually, one can imagine him, in a small little kampong house, maybe bigger than others, and that was so-called the palace. One has to see that this is the 10th, 9th century, and compare with the height of somewhere else, it was, I would say, a small kingdom, not really a superpower. Superpower will probably be a term used to describe the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire. I would just say it was a small little kingdom. A small little kingdom unmolested, undisturbed by other bigger brothers, so able to expand the borders to the biggest. But after Solomon, then the borders began to shrink because all the other neighbors, the Philistines, the Phoenicians, the Ammonites, the Amorites, Edomites, all began to expand the borders, and then Aram up north, and then Assyria eventually, all began to squeeze the borders, so the kingdom then got smaller. So I don't think it was a superpower. It was just that there was a period of a vacuum, and then so that was like God used that time for David Solomon to build a kingdom. But the moment after that, when Assyria start rising, by the 8th century, when Assyria comes, you find that, that's it, that the story goes downhill all the way.
Right. Question 4, I think you've answered this already. There is a speculation.
It's some people hold that view, but nobody knows, okay? You will ask the Ethiopian church, they say, oh, they'll say, yes, our descendant, came from that. Because you see, if you read the story of the nation of Ethiopia, there was a king called the Lion King, Emperor Haile Selassie. He lived around the time between the First World War and Second World War. And so when his nation was attacked by Italy during the war, Second World War, he actually went to the United Nations to make a plea, to defend his country. He was called the Lion King. And they traced the descendants all the way to this so-called son of Sheba and Solomon. So they believe the tradition. They themselves believe that they're descended from that. Okay. And of course, that will explain a little bit why. When you read Acts, you have that Ethiopian eunuch traveling all the way to Jerusalem to worship God. Because they say, well, because when Sheba came back, she brought back all these things from Solomon, as well as so-called that understanding of this God. And so the Ethiopians were really like proselytes. They were really converted to that Judaism faith. And so by the time you read Acts, Ethiopian now is a God-fearer. He worships the Yahweh, the God of the Jews, although he's from Ethiopia. So they actually trace their roots that way. In fact, of course, the Ethiopian church also claim that the ark is with them. There is this interesting story. National Geographic was supposed to have an expose, but the church eventually didn't pull aside the curtain to show us what was behind the curtain. They say in a certain church there, the ark is actually there, but again, we're not sure. Okay, so some people think that when she went back home, she actually carried a baby in her womb. That is a tradition, as I say. I have no idea how to prove that. We have no idea whether it's true or not.
Okay. Question 5 also a bit naughty. How did Solomon manage to spend so much time ruling the country and managing his wives and concubines?
Yeah, you should ask him. He has 700 wives and 300 concubines. That's 1,000. How I can't even remember one. You want to remember 1,000? Sometimes I can't even remember my wife's birthday or wedding anniversary. But I said, Marty, you want to remember 1,000 wives and concubines? Whose night tonight? I'm supposed to go to concubine number 295. You don't go to the wrong door. So you ask me how he can manage, I have no idea. Maybe his servants keep tab. They have all this whole list. Okay, today finish. Okay, move the name now to the back, and now the next one comes up the list.
Right, interesting logistics. All right, question 6. Why didn't David deal with Joab and Shimei himself? Okay, now Shimei,
as I say, he forgave Shimei when he took back the throne from Absalom. He says it's a day of rejoicing, there should be no more killing. So he actually forgave Shimei, and Shimei therefore got away with it. So now he cannot break his own oath, so he left it to the son. Find a way, son. I know your wisdom will find a way. Now, why didn't he deal with Joab? I have a very interesting theory. Joab knew too much secrets about David, especially about Uriah. You know why? Because remember, who did Solomon ask to get Uriah to go back to the battlefield? Joab. Okay, so he sent a letter to Joab through Uriah, and that letter is so obvious because the letter will say, Joab, put Uriah at the front line and make sure he dies. And if you're a commander, something is wrong. Why should the king want to kill his own favorite, mercenary and all this? Then eventually news comes back, and then within a few months, David marries a widow, and then the baby bump is already already so evident. People calculate, not even 9 months, baby is born. Everybody can put the pieces together. Joab knew something more than any others. The royal officials maybe suspect David already slept with Bathsheba, but Joab knew more. Joab knew David planned Uriah's death. He was the one responsible. And so you can imagine they were related. Joab and David were, David was actually uncle to Joab. Joab was his nephew. They're all related. But because Joab hold this knowledge, he could easily blackmail David anytime. That's why David could not move against him. So when Joab killed two other better commanders, okay, David just could not take action on Joab. Okay, there's no other reason why David could not remove him, because David is a king. He can easily remove a general and put another general. But I guess Joab knows too much. And that's why I think he just had to leave it alone. Left it to the son, Solomon, you have wisdom, you will find a way to get rid of this guy for me without incriminating yourself. And of course, somehow Solomon found a way to get rid of Joab. So Joab actually knew a bit more than any others. He knew that, you see how cruel was David? David sent Uriah's death warrant through Uriah to Joab. Someone asked, did Uriah peep into the letter? I say, I don't think he need to open the letter and peep and know what's the contents. He probably knew what was the contents, because the king was already acting very strange. Keep on asking Uriah, go back and sleep with your wife, go back and sleep with your wife. He refused. It's very obvious already. I think any Tom, Dick, and Harry will figure out something wrong somewhere. Okay, and then when you are carrying back a letter to Joab, and then suddenly you find yourself now being sent to the front line to fight, you know already the king is sending me to my death. Okay, so how cruel that he made Uriah carries his own death warrant to Joab to be carried out. So Joab, I think, would have used that to pressure David, and David always therefore had a weakness. Okay, someone knows a bit more. Okay, and so if he bows down, that's it. David will have to deal with the repercussions. Political blackmail. I suspect in Malaysia, there's a lot of political blackmail. You know, you keep tabs on me, like MACC keep a whole file on this guy. I open up the file, expose everything to you. And you don't be surprised, sometimes even pastors keep tabs like this on church members. I found that out in my own conference. My own boss, ex-boss, had tabs, files, huge files on all our colleagues. Okay, I mean, this is politics. This is life. Okay, in the political world, I guess everybody has letters on each other's, a huge dossier and file, and that's why sometimes you can't move. Okay.
Thanks, Doctor, for that. There's another question about logistics. Who formed the forced laborers? Were it the Israelites, or was it captives from conquest, or was it a mix from both?
They were two. They were also Israelites who actually built, and then there were also captives who, in times of war, conquered by David, who also were working. So I think the one who built the temple were their own people, conscripted. The English text uses the word forced labor drafted to build the temple. So that means they are not foreign captives. They are their own people. Just like Egypt, Egypt drafted their own people to build the pyramids. They were not slaves. It's a misconception. They were not slaves. They were people willing to build the pyramids for their pharaohs, because they see Pharaoh as a god. They were willing to work 6 months a year, and then every 6 months they go back home to do their own farming, and then they come again and serve 6 months a year to do. So the forced labor sort of thing was like this. That means you give, let's say, 3 months a year to help to build a king. Then the next 3 months you go back home to your family, and then you come back again the next round, another 3 months like that. So that was a forced conscription. So I think it is Israelite in that sense. It was the other captives, those that were captured, then they were used to build perhaps all the other parts, the Milo, the fortified cities as well.
Okay, thank you for that. Next one is a more practical question in terms of application. What can the church in Malaysia today learn from the lessons of Solomon and David and King?
Yeah, I really threw out some at the end of my conclusion. Okay, what legacy we're going to leave behind? Will we act like the early Solomon or the later Solomon? Will we be like David, leaving behind deathbed wishes for others to carry out? And then you can say, I wash, no, David is like Pontius Pilate, I wash my hands. Okay, this is out, this is not my matter. I wash my hands. And the problem is he left it to the son. Okay, so poor son started off his reign with blood of 3 persons on his hands. Okay, so a lot of us always think that Solomon, the man of peace, started off his kingdom with wisely, but he had to carry out his father's wishes. So, I mean, what type of father would actually entrust a son to start off and stain his hands with blood? Okay, if David was really a real man, he should have done all this, settle his own business, and not pass it on to the son. But remember, the whole story of David starts off with the story of the loss of his impotence. The loss of his impotence is actually a way to signal his inability to govern anymore, the inability to even make decisions, the inability to even sense that there was something amiss. I mean, the old king is so feeble, lying on his bed, cuddling Abishag to keep himself warm, not even realizing another son was already planning a coup d'etat somewhere else. No, it means it's like he doesn't even know what's going on in his kingdom. That was the stage he had come to. And so we talk about senile leaders running our country, people who are 93 years old, who should long retire and enjoy their grandchildren, or should still coming back into politics and make a mess out of politics. I think there are a lot of lessons to learn. Okay. One can draw out many, many lessons. So I hope in your preaching, in your series, is where you begin to draw all these lessons from the text.
Right. Question 9 was Solomon considered a man after God's heart like his father David?
That phrase is only used for David. Okay, that phrase is only used for David, a man after God's own heart. Solomon was never given the same title. Okay, so Solomon's titles will probably be just the wisest man, no one has wisdom like him on the earth. So he doesn't have that title of a man after God's own heart, because his own heart, we can see, was obviously divided. Right at the beginning of his reign, he wants that political marriage with Pharaoh's daughter to get horses, okay, to consolidate himself. Of course, you can see Egypt was on the southwest of Israel. If you make friends and then you become son-in-law to Pharaoh, then you don't have an enemy on the southwestern part of your borders. You don't have to worry about always Egypt coming to attack you. You're already now son-in-law. See, so political alliances like this has a lot of benefits. You in terms of trade, in terms of protection, security, in terms of then making that exchange, a barter for horses. So you'd be wise to know how to make alliances, because sometimes in a fight, you must know where to pick your battles and who to fight. You can't be fighting against everybody. Okay, sometimes you may have to maneuver yourself. And the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Okay, politics is like this: the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Okay, because if the enemy of my enemy, it means we're on the same side. We all don't like this common guy. You see, so sometimes you may have to make alliances like this to keep yourself afloat and keep yourself in power. Of course, he pays the price for this. Okay, he ends up having Pharaoh's daughter, who obviously bring her gods with her. But we know that his heart was like his father. I think David's sin with Bathsheba affected the whole family. You don't have time to go backward. We can go backward in 2 Samuel. You can see his sin with Bathsheba throws a spanner into the whole family thing. The son, Absalom, when he usurped the father's throne, remember what did Absalom do? The first thing he did, took all his father's concubines and wives and his harem, slept with them on the rooftop of the palace in front of everybody to show my father's concubines and wives are all mine. Notice that was what the son did, Absalom. Okay. So same type of power play. I'm now the new king. All my father's wives and all this are now my possession, my harem. Okay. Now where do you learn this lesson from? Obviously looking at the father. See? And then you have another son raping the stepsister. And the father, David, doesn't do anything about it. I see the weaknesses all fall in. And by the time you come to this fourth son, Adonijah, again, you can see he doesn't care about whether the father is dead. He wants the power. He cannot wait. And then Solomon obviously picks up the same trait. He loves women just like his father. Look, David collected wives. How many wives did David have? 4 or 5. Okay, so in the same way, Solomon, looking at his father, chip on the old block. So one can say that Solomon cannot carry the same title like the father, a man after God's own heart. I don't think he will earn that because his heart was obviously very divided.
Right, thank you. We still have a few more questions. I just want to start with something that's related to this. How is this that in 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 1, Solomon formed a marriage alliance with Egypt, something that God has disapproved of. And yet in 1 Kings chapter 3, the book mentions that Solomon loved the Lord, walking in all his statutes. So why is there a contradiction here? In the first 3 verses of 1 Kings chapter 3.
He loved the Lord, but he was also trying to be smart to make an alliance with the biggest power of the day. Okay, and then he also, as I say, had probably the motive of wanting horses. Who else had horses? Only Egypt. Okay, Egypt has the best cavalry at that time, chariots at that time. So if you want horses, you have no other choice. I think it was a marriage of convenience. To get something out, you have to enter into that marriage and get the benefits of it. So you can say perhaps maybe he didn't love Pharaoh's daughter in the first place. That he was the one that writes to Pharaoh and say, "I want to marry your daughter because I love her." No, I think he says that he made a marriage alliance, an alliance sealed by marriage, knowing very well what he was getting into. So I think it was a political maneuver right at the beginning of his reign, and it comes after the statement, and the kingdom of Solomon was established. You see. So after establishing, then the next move, consolidate his power by building up the cavalry, the chariots. Where do I find horses? Egypt. So a marriage of convenience, get the horses. And some people say maybe from there, that's where his heart was led astray, loving Pharaoh's daughter, make him then love other foreign women as well. Okay. So it's like in the beginning, you can see Solomon is like David, good guy, yet has weakness. Okay, so David was also like that. Started off a good guy, but eventually you find the weaknesses also came in. Okay, so I think is people are contradiction sometimes. I don't think it is an either or where we are so perfect. I think we are often a contradiction. Yes, we love God, we want to follow. So David, a man after God's own heart, and yet David was a murderer who got rid of Uriah. So we are, in a way, people of contradictions. On one hand, yes, we love God, but on the other hand, we are also still sinners.
Thank you. There's just 2 more questions. For the first one is David had Nathan. So basically, the Lord sent Nathan to rebuke David. But why wasn't Solomon told of his sins and given a chance to repent?
I think by the time Nathan is very old. That's why we don't find him much in the picture, except only the first 2 chapters. I think it's already like it's past his time. There'll be other seers and prophets like God and all this taking over. So Nathan is already like past his prime. That's why he's no longer mentioned in the last chapters of 2 Samuel. He only pops up because he sees what's happening, and because Bathsheba contacts him, and they gang up together to get David, to galvanize David to move. So it is like he came back only in the last minute to do something. So he wasn't like a prophet kept by Solomon to continue being a prophet. I think already past his prime. So I would see chapter 1 and 2 as his one last act, maybe before his old age and death. So you find the rest of the time of the other 40 years of Solomon, there's no other prophet. Solomon doesn't seem to have a prophet, unlike David, who had Nathan, who also had Gad, G-A-D, and also there's another seer as well. So David has at least 3, but Solomon doesn't seem to have any. Here's maybe we can say, maybe Solomon thought he was the wisest man, he doesn't need prophets. Okay, and prophets will come back into the picture at the end of the book of 2 Kings. Why does that book of Kings, 1 Kings, and the beginning of 2 Kings end with the story of Elijah and start with the story of Elisha? It's to remind us that prophets were sent to the kings as a watchdog. Almost every king had a prophet as a watchdog to remind the king, lest the king forgets. Solomon, I think, probably felt he had no need for prophets or dispense of the prophets. We don't find a single prophet in the 40 years of Solomon's reign. Okay, and that's why Elijah comes back again. Elisha comes back again to remind that there are prophets for every king. So Amos, Hosea, Micah were all prophets, and Isaiah were all prophets of the 8th century, ministering to the kings of the north and the south. And then you have Jonah, and then Obadiah, Joel, Habakkuk, all these ministering in the 7th century prophets. And then you have the 5th century Zephaniah, and then post-exilic you have only 3 because there's no more kings. So prophets therefore have a role, and kings are supposed to look at the prophets like a watchdog to warn them. The failure and absence of mentioning any prophets in the time of Solomon from chapter 3 onwards to 11, maybe it's a way to tell us that Solomon doesn't have a prophet, or he didn't want a prophet, thinking that his wisdom was enough. Okay. Prophets and wise men are 2 different tasks. Wise men discerns and understand the wisdom that God has given, and then use it to understand the ways and working in the world. Prophets hear the word of God and then pass the message to the people concerned. So there is a need for both. I think Solomon felt that with my wisdom, I will know God myself. I don't need someone else to speak and tell me God's word. And that's where maybe that was one of the fatal errors. Because I look at those chapters from 3 to 11, you don't find a single prophet mentioned among Solomon's. Okay, whereas the story of David, you find prophets coming into the picture many times.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. There's just one more last question. The last one is, did Solomon gain territory through his marriages? Or do we have any evidence?
Yeah, could be. But David already expanded the borders almost to the max. So Solomon just continued on, because you can see the natural borders. On the west is the sea, you can't go further. On the south is the desert, up to the river, the brook of Egypt, the river of Egypt. Beyond that is the Sinai Desert, so not much to conquer that way. Towards the north, you hit the mountains, the Lebanon mountains. So you can only go northeast and east in a sense. But you go northeast and east, you hit Aram territory, the Ammonites, Amorites, and all this. So there was the only way to go was east. And east was where already David conquered. Because remember, David conquered the Ammonites, and that was the story of Uriah being sent to the forefront to Ammon. And Joab wins and conquered the city, asked David to go to be coronated there. So already the Ammonites have been defeated. So the borders already are stretched to the maximum already. Beyond the Ammonites, you hit the Saudi Arabian desert. And again, not worthwhile conquering a desert. I mean, logically, what for you want to conquer a desert? It's desert area beyond the Ammonites. That means beyond Amman, the capital city of the Ammonites, there's all desert towards the east. Okay, so I think already the borders are stretched to the maximum already under David. So it is only after Solomon you find the borders shrink, because the moment the kingdom split, the 2 border wars appear between northern kingdom of Israel and Aram. And Aram will chip at the northern border and take some of the cities of the northern kingdom. So you find that the kingdom actually will shrink after this instead of expanding.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Anthony Lok, for the session today.